So, welcome back to another episode in our Resolution Insight series. And today we're talking about workplace mediation. And what I wanted to do was try and strip things back a little bit and go back to basics and just talk about exactly what workplace mediation is, why it's important, some of the pitfalls, and just learn from both kind of Sarah and John's experience. So, joined by Sarah and John, welcome.
Hi,
Thank you.
Trish.
Before we get started, what I thought would be useful is for you to maybe just do a little bit of an introduction so that the viewers and listeners understand why you're here. So, John, can we start off with you? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yes, thank you, Trish. Great to be here, and to have the opportunity to talk about mediation, which has been a passion of mine for, I suppose, about 30 years now. I first trained as a mediator, as a community mediator back in 1996, and so it is 30 years this year, and started working with neighbours who were in dispute with one another, and then thought it would be a good idea to take that into the workplace. So in 1999, set up a workplace mediation practice, which was then called Mediation at Work, and have really been promoting and working as a mediator ever since. It makes an awful lot of sense to me because I think it's actually a better way of being in the world, to find ways of being able to work out our conflicts and our disputes, which are inevitable, but the way in which we respond to them can be really helpful or not so helpful.
Thank you. Sarah, tell us a bit about you as well.
Thanks, Trish. And happy to be here. I have a slightly different route into becoming a mediator. So I was an employment lawyer for about 18 years, and I mostly did litigation. So I was mostly in court and employment tribunals where people were falling out at the very sort of end stages of a dispute. I did that for years. I enjoyed it, but I started getting involved in mediations as a lawyer representing a party. So I would sometimes sit there with a mediator and both sides chatting through an issue and a dispute, and started to really see the power of it and how helpful it was, and how the opportunity to resolve things at the early stage was something that I was really interested in. So I did workplace mediation training when I was still being a lawyer, but I had a dream that I wanted to move out of law and become a workplace mediator. So I did do that in 2018, started working with Resolution at Work, and have been mediating in workplace disputes since then. So the thing for me, I identify with what John was saying about it being a passion, but for me, it's I came to it because I saw how damaging and destructive that sort of end stage legal process and legal process as a whole can be within workplace disputes, and thought that other way, there is another way here, which I think can be so helpful at an earlier stage to resolve conflicts. So hopefully I can help people avoid the need to get over in this end stage where I was before, where people end up in court and really nobody really wins. You kind of have a token winner, but I think the fact that the disputes got to those late stages shows that nobody's won really. So to get back to an early stage to resolve it before things get out of control is kind of what I really enjoy doing now.
I think John and I definitely share that. We're both kind of nodding like, yes. It's that passion for being able to do things differently before it kind of gets to that difficult stage. Totally agree. So breaking it down then, and I guess to start off kind of in simple terms, how would we describe what workplace mediation is? So if we were talking to somebody who had no clue what we do, how would we describe workplace mediation? And Sarah, you are nodding the most, so I'm going to go with you first.
Well, don't nod. I think I would say it's a guided conversation between two people, usually with a mediator present, to help try and solve a problem, an issue without further conflict, where the parties really have the say and the control into how it works, but the mediator's there not taking sides or making decisions, but helping the parties move to a place where they can hopefully sort of solve things themselves.
John, anything else from you on that? Would you agree?
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that mediation is radically different from other dispute resolution processes. In that, as Sarah was saying, it puts the parties in control of the outcome. Um, Almost every other dispute resolution process that you can think of, it's the third party, whether it's the arbitrator or the judge or a panel or whatever, they make the judgment about who's in the right and who's in the wrong. With mediation, there is no question of right and wrong. It's about enabling those people to get back to a point where they can work it out for themselves. So the core thing is about the relationship between the two people. And as we all know, if relationships are right, we can solve almost anything. If relationships are wrong, we can't even agree who's going to do the washing up. So mediation is about saying, all right, you started it, the relationship's gone wrong. How can we help you to get back to a point where you can negotiate directly with one another without the need for someone else to be involved?
I think that leads perfectly into my next question. So you talked about it being kind of radically different, and I'm interested in when workplace mediation can be used. So when can organisations think, I want to use a workplace mediation as an intervention as opposed to using a more formal HR process, in your view?
I think it's more a question of when is it appropriate for the parties to use workplace mediation? Because if the organisation makes that available to people, then if people say, we really ought to be able to work this out for ourselves, and we need someone to help us to do that. So if the parties are saying, yeah, we would like to use mediation, that's when it's appropriate. And very often the organization might be very keen for people to use mediation, but if the parties themselves are thinking, you know what, no, we want to go down the formal route, then we can encourage, we can cajole, we can try to persuade, but in the end, it's down to them. And if they're saying, yep, we want to try to resolve this for ourselves, that's when it's appropriate.
To pick up on something John just said, I think the key is organisations trying to aim to normalise mediation as an option and as a positive, sort of proactive tool, rather than what we still sometimes see, which is it's a last resort when a relationship's already breaking down. So, often there's a formal HR process will already have happened, and an outcome from that is the parties should go to mediation. Whereas as much as possible, if an organisation can encourage a culture where mediation's an option, as John said, the parties know it's an option, that it can help to avoid things at an earlier stage, we can get people into thinking about mediation and potentially come to mediation before they even raise a formal dispute. And I think a link point is that sometimes organisations are reluctant to use mediation where a formal dispute has already been raised, so where someone's formalised a complaint. I think sometimes there's a temptation as an organisation to say, we need to deal with this formally. We have a process, so we'll follow that process. Whereas there's still the opportunity to step off, if the parties want to do it, to raise it with them and say, look, there's another option. And to really just put on hold a formal process and see if mediation can help things. But I think it is really about trying to normalise it and so that as an organisation, people know it's there and that it's an option.
Why do you think things are kind of weighted the wrong way at the moment? Where, you mentioned mediation being a last resort. Why do you think we're kind of generally in that space and people don't think about it in the kind of proactive, kind of positive ways that we've been talking about?
I think perhaps it is an issue of sometimes just a lack of awareness or knowledge about the process and the options available and what they are. Things like we're talking about today, like what is it? What does it look like? How does it work? But I think also it's sometimes a cultural thing within an organisation. I think having a culture of being very open, discussing things, being comfortable with conflict, that kind of thing, and having mediation there as an option. All of those things, I may make it sound like a small thing, the cultural thing is huge. But if you can get that kind of culture where people are used to talking about things, people don't sweep things under the carpet, people at the top lead by example, that people have difficult conversations, I think all those things really help.
Mm.
And if I could just add to that, that I think that we've tended to think of conflict as somehow being a bad thing. Conflict, I think, is actually a very useful resource, because it's an indication that there's friction, there's a difference of opinion, there's more than one way of looking at a particular set of circumstances. And instead of saying, oh, goodness me, we must try to resolve it, how about saying, that's interesting. What is it that's going on here that indicates there's something that we need to be able to talk about? And I think also that I don't know about you, Sarah, but the number of times when at the end of a mediation, the parties turn to the mediator and say, oh, if only we'd had this available to us at the outset, we could have avoided all of this. And it's tragic that mediation is, as you were saying, Sarah, it's almost a kind of a last resort rather than being the first resort. Because if you say to people at the start of a working relationship, look, everything's great, you're really getting on well. However, it might just be that at some point you might fall out with one another. If you do, how would you like to resolve it? And 9 times out of 10, people will say, well, we need to talk about it. But actually, the processes that we have available to us in organizations don't encourage people to talk to one another. In fact, the very first thing that can happen sometimes if you take out a formal grievance is that your union rep or your HR advisor will say, okay, you must stop talking to one another now, and you must start to gather evidence of what it is that's gone wrong, which just drives people apart. And what we're saying is, actually, you are best placed to find a mutually acceptable way forward here. So let's do that sooner rather than later.
I never really thought about that. That point you just made was really powerful, the impact of those more formal processes where people are just told to stop talking to each other, or people are suspended and things like that. It just drives a wedge in terms of that communication piece. That's such a very powerful point, John. Okay.
It's kind of formalized revenge.
Oh, wow.
Well, it's in a way, most of those processes that we have they're about gathering evidence about who's at fault, and although we wouldn't describe it as punishing them, actually there is a form of punishment there. You might get a warning, or you might get suspension, or you might not get the pay rise that you were expecting. Whereas what mediation is about is saying, yeah, sometimes people get things wrong. How can we help you put things right so that you can get back into an effective working relationship? Doesn't mean to say people have to be best mates, but it does mean that people can find a way of getting back into a healthy working relationship.
I think the problem with the formal processes is that by the time you get to that stage and people raising complaints, the relationship's usually broken down. They're usually about relationship breakdown, aren't they? And the problem with the formal process, in my experience, is that it just entrenches those positions. It doesn't help. Hardly ever does it help. It entrenches people in their positions. They become more polarized. As John said, they're kept apart. You have interviews, people don't know what the other person's saying. That whole formalization is so damaging. And it's meant to be a way to address concerns, but actually it usually ends up just causing more, in my experience, and causes more problems.
So thinking about what mediation actually is, how would you describe what actually happens during a mediation session? So for anybody that's not been through it, what could they expect if they decided to enter into mediation? Don't know who wants to go first. John, do you want to go first?
So, the bare bones of it are that it's a facilitated conversation where the mediator, and the mediation takes various forms, but the form that we use at resolution of work in the workplace is that the mediator would meet with each of the people involved separately. So just having a confidential one-to-one discussion to help them to think through what it is that they want from the mediation process, and to know that they can say whatever they want to say, and the mediator's not going to go to the other party and say, oh, you never guess what they said, and they're not going to go back to HR, and they're not going to say anything. It's completely confidential. Although we always have to add that if maintaining confidentiality ended up meaning that we had to break the law, well, that's a different matter. But the default, if you like, is that it's confidential. And then if both of the parties agree, and only if they agree, the mediator will meet with both parties together, and that discussion usually starts off with each person having an opportunity to say whatever they want to say by way of introduction, as much or as little as they want to say. And then a more open discussion between the two of them, with the mediator maybe asking some questions and summarizing points. And usually at some point, we get to a point where we're saying, all right, where do you want things to go from here? And sometimes that can end up as being a formal agreement, which the mediator can help the parties to decide on the wording of that. But more often, it's just that a report goes back to whoever commissioned the mediation and saying the mediation's taken place, but not necessarily the content of it, because that's confidential to the parties. And usually that's the end of the process. So it's quite a short, sharp intervention, and the structure is quite fluid, but it has a sort of a beginning, a middle, and an end, and the mediator is there to manage that.
When you said short, sharp intervention, so generally, how long does a mediation take?
Well, it varies quite a lot, because it depends whether that's happening online and whether the one-to-one meetings with the parties are taking place on the same day or on a different day. If it's happening all in person, then it could be that the mediator would meet with each of the parties separately in the morning and then have a joint meeting with them in the afternoon. And so it's all contained within a single day. And at other times, for operational reasons, it's just not possible to bring people together into the same room at the same time. And so it may be that it happens online. But the actual mediation meeting itself doesn't usually last more than 2, maybe 3 hours at the most.
You also talked about when there's the initial meeting where you have those initial one-to-ones and then people decide whether or not they want to move forward. What happens in those situations where people decide that they don't want to move forward, they don't agree to those kind of next steps?
That's their prerogative, and the outcome is in their hands, and the mediator respects that. And this is where being a mediator is quite tough, because you hear what people have got to say, and inevitably you might kind of form an opinion and think, well, if they were to do this or if they were to do that, but that's not the mediator's job. The mediator's job is to help them to understand why it is that they're doing what they're doing and why they're behaving in the way that they're behaving, and to be satisfied that is in their best interest. So the mediator doesn't pass any judgment at all on what it is the parties are saying, how they want to proceed. And there are lots of occasions where actually what's in people's best interest is for them to say, do you know what? We've come to the end of the road. We don't have an ongoing working relationship. We're not going to get to that point. So how do we come to a satisfactory parting of the ways, and to do that in a decent, civilized way? And it's unusual, but if that's the outcome, then the mediator will be saying, well, that is just as successful as the parties walking off into the sunset hand in hand, and it's all sweetness and light.
Yeah, I think it's really important to pick up on something John said, that we don't push people into a process. So I'm always really keen when I speak with, I tend to do most of my work now virtually. So I'll have that. One of the advantages of that is it's easier for people to fit it into their diaries, because I'll usually look for a 1.5 hour pre-meet with each person, and then usually a 3 hour-ish mediation. And I try and do them across, a period that's quite close together, like a week or something. But it's really important, I think, when I have that first meeting with individuals, that I'm very clear to them that there is no obligation on them to move to the joint meeting. Because I think sometimes if people felt that pressure, they want to have an exploratory conversation with me first, discuss the parameters, what mediation is, what their situation is. And I always say to people, there's absolutely I'm not putting the joint meeting in the diary at the moment. There's absolutely no obligation on you to do that. Part of the pre-meet for me is an opportunity for me to talk to them about the process and to answer any questions they've got, and them to discuss any concerns they've got with me about the process, and for us both to assess whether or not mediation is something that is appropriate. Because whilst, as John says, it's in their hands, as a mediator, we also have to think about, is this the right thing for this situation? And generally speaking, it will be, but there are occasions, and I've had one recently, where it probably isn't sensible to put these people in a room together, even in a virtual room. So it's really that first meeting. I think people tend to think of it as that's for them to tell me the background as a mediator, what's been going on, their situation, so I can understand it. But I think there's a lot more that goes on in that meeting as well, which is them making sure they're comfortable with the process, me making sure this is a situation that is appropriate for mediation, and discussing, as I say, any concerns or issues that they've got about the process. And then, only then, if both of them are comfortable, and I usually ask them to reflect and come back to me, if they're comfortable, then we'll proceed to a joint meeting.
I think people feeling as though not feeling as though, people actually having a choice in the situation is huge here, right? Like, if I don't feel
having agency, yeah, absolutely.
Forced discussion, well, then it's never going to be a positive outcome, right? But having that choice and that ability to say, do you know what, it's not for me, or it is, I think that's incredibly important. Totally agree. So are there any kind of myths or misconceptions about workplace mediation that you feel that people might have, or things that you've heard? Obviously, John, you've been doing this 30 years. I'm sure you've heard a lot. And Sarah, you've been doing it a long time too. What kind of myths or incorrect assumptions do you often hear about mediation?
I think one of the key ones is that people think mediation is a soft touch. It's not. It's a really tough choice. Because it's not about rescuing people from the reality of the conflict that the dispute that they're engaged in. It's not taking it away. And I think one of the myths as well is that the mediator will somehow wave a magic wand and make things okay. The mediator is there just to help people to have that conversation. I mean, I expect, Sarah, you've had this experience as well, where the parties will kind of turn to you as the mediator and say, well, what do you think? and having to disappoint people in a way, often by kind of saying, well, I'm not here to say what I think. I'm here to help you to say what you think. So the power of the mediator, that's one of the myths. Yeah.
I think one of the things that follows on from that as well, the role of the mediator. We discuss this with people at the pre-meet in terms of what our role is. But I think some people still feel that they're going to be judged, that by coming to a process like that, we're going to be, either we're going to be telling them someone's right and someone's wrong, which of course we don't do, or even if we're not telling them, that we are judging them. That as a mediator, you have a position that you're going to adopt, and that you're kind of, act accordingly, that will guide how you deal with mediation. Because I think people, when they're in a conflict situation, to badge it as that, they often feel that that's something that's happening. They feel, whether it's HR, the person they're in conflict with, I think sometimes, or they're told by management, you've got to sort this out, they feel a bit like there's a judgment on them. And I think sometimes people think a mediation process is almost like a continuation of that, which of course it isn't. And similarly, something I've had come up a few times, and I'm sure you've heard this as well, John, is people thinking that mediating is them admitting fault, or that by coming, particularly when the other person is the one who suggested mediation. So quite a strong thing that comes through for me is when I'm dealing with someone who's in a position of seniority to the person who's asked for the mediation. So you often get an employee saying, what problem with my line manager, or someone who's senior to me, and they ask for mediation. Sometimes the manager thinks that by acceding to that request and going to mediation, that they're already admitting that they did something wrong. Or conversely, if they don't go to the mediation, the HR or their manager will think they are basically saying, yeah, I have messed up here. So people have interesting connotations around what attending a mediation might mean for them, or what it might look like, or how other people might read it. So again, that's something that I often have to talk through and reassure people about. I mean, obviously, if they have that perception for them that's happening in the workplace, I can't say that isn't happening, but certainly mediation is not intended to do any of those things that I've just mentioned.
Okay. And are there any kind of common mistakes that you see organisations make when they're looking to use mediation?
Yeah, using it too late.
Yeah.
We're just thinking about how one of the things that we've been thinking about is how to enable organizations to become what we describe as being conflict positive. And in if you like, an organization that sees conflict as being a potential resource, then the sooner you can get people to a point where they're able to talk to one another face to face to resolve things, the better. So yes, mediation being available too late in the process.
Yeah, I think for me it's a similar point, but people often insisting on going down that formal route, or almost encouraging people to go down it. So, I often hear of managers, or I have people sitting in a mediation and the other person saying, well, why did we end up in that formal process? Why did we go down that route? And often the other person says, well, I don't really want to, but HR told me I had to, or my manager said I needed to formalize it, or I needed to put it in writing. And you end up with two people sat in a mediation, again, as John said earlier on, sort of saying, why weren't we here before? Why didn't this happen earlier? So for me, it links to, as John said, leaving it too late, often forcing people to go down a different route first, almost like you've got to do that first, which of course you don't have to.
And I'm not sure this is a silly question now, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Are there any particular types of conflict in the workplace that are kind of best suited to mediation, or can it just be used for any type of workplace conflict? What do you guys think?
I think there are, to look at the question a different way, I think there are some cases or conflicts that shouldn't go to mediation. There's not a lot of them, but things like, serious misconduct, sometimes things like, I had a couple of cases, I don't say very often that I don't think something should be mediated, but two that stand out for me is one where there was quite a serious campaign of bullying and harassment being alleged, and an issue with the psychological safety of the person who was saying that there were these things going on, and then being in a situation they had to mediate with the other person. Sometimes if that hits a certain level, it isn't a comfortable thing, and I don't think someone should be put in that position. Similarly, I had one that was about sexual harassment, so felt like that person shouldn't be mediating with this person. And I think when there's a very strong power imbalance, in some cases that might not work. And of course, obvious things like where there's been sort of alleged criminal behaviour or physical violence and things like that, you wouldn't want to put those people in a room together. But generally speaking, I think for most workplace conflicts, whatever they're about, they're usually underneath it. It's about the relationship, the working relationship between the people that are in the room mediating. And pretty much always, I would say you can try and mediate your way through that.
Yeah, I think Sarah makes a really important point there about it being to do with the relationship. And I remember discussing with one of the other mediators recently that the difference, if you like, between an approach to mediation where you're keen for people to reach an agreement, or where you're keen for the people, or where the people are wanting to restore the relationship. So if I can make a difference between those two, you can restore a working relationship without reaching agreement. In fact, it might be quite a healthy working relationship where you're able to say to one another, we fundamentally disagree on this point, but we respect one another as people. So we maintain the relationship while we disagree. It's very difficult if you look at it the other way around and say, well, the important thing is to reach an agreement, and it doesn't really matter about the relationship. But very often the procedures that we have are about whether whether people reach an agreement or not, even though the relationship may be completely shot to pieces. And very often at the end of a grievance procedure, there may be a recommendation about how people can continue to work together, but the relationship is well, as I said, it's shot to pieces, and no matter how comprehensive the agreement may be, if the relationship isn't right, it's not going to last. On the other hand, if the relationship is good, people may be able to respect the different positions that others are taking up, and that is a healthy organization. That's the attention that we require. So, for example, I remember working with I think it was a housing association where this was actually more of a dispute between different teams. There was the development team on the one hand, and there was the finance team on the other. Well, the finance team were quite clearly, their job was to make sure that the organization was spending its money in the wisest possible way. The development team were quite keen to explore how they could build more houses so that they could provide affordable housing for more people. Now, there's a structural conflict between those two. And if the relationship is good, they can be respecting one another and say, well, that's fine. You're saying that for this reason. We're saying this for this reason. If the relationship is gone, where they're suspicious of one another and people are accusing one another of undermining them and all the rest of it, it's not going to work.
Have you got any stories like that as well? If that's a really lovely kind of practical example. Have there been any particularly challenging mediations that you've done? Obviously not naming names or sharing anything confidential.
Quite a few challenging ones, yeah. I think one where I think that sticks with me, where I think mediation did make a real difference. And I think it shows the power of having the opportunity to step outside of the workplace day-to-day scenario and have some space with somebody else, an independent external third person who can help you explore things that would be potentially very difficult to talk about otherwise, or that you can't find the time and space to talk about in the workplace. And that's I often have quite moving moments in mediations where you see almost like the penny drop, sometimes for both people at the same time, about something that they've been in dispute about. Suddenly they both realize, that it's like a moment of clarity almost, where things shift and you feel the tension in the room shift, and the positions that people come into the room in sometimes, which is sometimes people can't even look at each other, or don't want to talk to each other, don't want to be in the same room together, even virtually. And you have that moment of shift. And one that stands out for me, I mean, I've had that in a lot of mediations at the moment, because I think mediation encourages that really as a process to happen. But I had an individual who had ADHD and autism, who was fairly open about that with the line manager, but hadn't really found the space to talk about sort of what that meant in terms of the sort of things they wanted to be done differently slightly in the workplace around them to help them. And part of that was that they felt that the manager hadn't shown curiosity and interest in asking about that. So you had two people that didn't really understand how to deal with the situation, hadn't had the opportunity to have an honest discussion about it. The manager in turn felt very unsupported themselves within the workplace in terms of managing someone who had potentially different needs to some of the other people in the workplace, because it wasn't a supportive environment for them to be able to have those conversations. So the individual didn't understand that the manager also had issues with feeling unsupported, which meant that impacted how the manager dealt with this individual. So getting into the room and talking about it openly, the employees started talking more about, what they wanted from the manager that they hadn't really felt they could speak about properly before because they felt unsupported. The manager was surprised that the individual hadn't been able to speak to them, but explained to them why they felt it was hard to support them because of the issues they were having from their management. And suddenly you get this situation where two people that felt both misunderstood in different ways, but didn't quite realise the other person felt as misunderstood as they were, suddenly could see that it wasn't just about that other person. It's a bigger picture that's going on organisationally, which sometimes impacts how they're both behaving. And that was a moment where they had a really good, really positive discussion. The employee had already raised a grievance, and as a result, they withdrew the grievance. They put guidelines in place about how they would work together, how frequently they catch up, and all that good stuff that you sort of hope people are going to come out of mediation with. So I think for me, giving people that opportunity to step off the conveyor belt at work and kind of have some almost like protected time where they can talk about things in a different way, because I think all these conversations, John, that we have with people in mediations, they wouldn't happen otherwise. The mediation gives them the space to have those conversations and explore it in a way that they just wouldn't be able to otherwise, I think. And those moments are really satisfying when that happens.
Yeah, and just something to add to that one of the things that's so different about the work that we do is that it's future focused. So much of the conflict and dispute resolution processes that are available to people are looking back. They're looking at the past. And what this is about is letting go of the past. There's a wonderful phrase I came across. It was that true reconciliation is when you can be in the presence of your adversary with not one jot of ill feeling. That's real reconciliation. And if that's what you're working towards, then it's about letting go of the way things used to be in the past, and letting go of the hope of a different past, which may sound like a rather strange thing to be saying, but so much of what we do in helping people to resolve disputes is to say, well, how can we make amends? How can we put things right? Who needs to be punished? Who needs to be found at fault? What sanctions need to be applied? What we're talking about is, how do you want things to be in the future? And what do you need to say, and what do you need to hear in order to enable you to move on? And that's not about denying the past. It's not about somehow pretending that it hasn't happened. It's about saying, things did go badly wrong. However, if we just focus on that and we keep on about the past, what does that mean for the future? So mediation is future focus.
I often think about it, John, as it being people letting go of what's happened.
Yeah.
And the process, I think, really helps with that, because I often feel that the pre-meet, as well as all the other things I talked about earlier about the pre-meeting and the objectives of that, it's also quite cathartic for people, because they can sit and talk to somebody about what's been going on for them and how they've been feeling and the impact things have had on them. And then they, having had that discussion, they kind of bring that into the mediation, the joint meeting, because as John says, it's future focused. But I'll sort of always say to people, we've got to look a bit about what's happened so that we can then work out how we can do it differently in the future. And giving them that opportunity, in particular at the pre-meet, to really get it all out really helps them with that process, I think, if they're ready and willing to do so, of trying to let go of the past and what hasn't worked. It's a really important part of the process, I think.
And that's why I was saying earlier that mediation is not a soft touch.
Yeah.
It's quite painful, because it does mean acknowledging that I might have contributed in some way to the breakdown in the relationship with my colleague. They may have contributed to it as well. But we're going to try to let that be in the past, because we can see there are benefits in moving forward together, and accepting that there will be occasions when people say, nope, that's not going to work. we're not going to let go of the past. And that's their right. And that's why those other formal processes are there. And that if people want to escalate the dispute and go down the formal investigation route, that's their prerogative, that's their right. But sadly, that tends to be the norm, that people go down the formal route rather than saying, let's see if we can resolve this for ourselves.
I knew this was going to be a good conversation, and I've kind of got lost listening to the two of you. So thank you so much for your time. But I am conscious of time, which means I probably need to bring things to a close. So, in true kind of Jerry Springer style, final thoughts. Is there anything in particular that you would like to get across to the people who are watching this that you feel is really important or impactful in terms of mediation? I thought that you were just both doing it then, to be fair, so it feels a little bit mean to ask you again. But anything additional that you want to add before we wrap up?
I think I've probably already covered this, but I think for me, the key thing is aiming to try and normalise mediation as a process within an organisation as a positive, proactive tool, not a last resort, push button emergency because the relationship's broken down. And promoting it really so that people know it's there and so that people understand what it is as well, so that they feel empowered, that it's a choice that they can make. And really, it comes back to culture, sort of integrating it into the organisational culture and positive. And that means getting leadership buy-in to mediation, highlighting early intervention benefits. I think it's so important, so that people know that it's there and that it's an option, and people really knowing about it.
A final thought is that it's the people who lead organizations who are the ones who have the power to change the culture and to introduce a culture in the organization where resolving disputes and conflict is the norm, and to do it through a facilitated process. And rather than running away from conflict, to be saying, let's embrace it, let's see what it's got to offer, and let's see how we can enhance people's experience of working in this organization, because we resolve things together.
Amazing. Look, thank you both so much for your time. It's been an absolutely delightful conversation, and we will definitely be doing this again. But thank you. Really appreciate you both.
Thank
You're
you, Trish.
welcome.
Thanks,
Thank
Tom.
you. Thanks.